You both touched on Diane Rwigara's release on bail and her pending judicial hearing. I wonder if you could help shed some light on what might be happening with the other detainee releases and sort of granting of clemency to certain other individuals, some of whom had been considered by some critics of the government to be political detainees, although obviously there are also debates about the charges against them and concerns about judicial process, even where the substance of the charges might be in debate. So I wonder if you could comment on some of those cases and what we might be seeing, if this is any cause for thinking that there is a change in tactics, or if those developments reflect something else.
It's a tricky question, Matt. So there were these mass prisoner released in September of this year. I think around 2,000 people were released, not all of whom were prisoners of conscience, but some of the country's most prominent prisoners of conscience, such as Victoire Ingabire, were released. And I think at first blush, we in the international community thought, okay, this is a good sign. This is a sign either that, Rwanda is beginning to pay attention to some of the, international condemnation that they're getting from other governments and from the human rights community. But then President Kagame made a series of remarks where he was very clear that these releases were not in fact related to public pressure, international pressure, and no one should think otherwise. And he made one particular remark that we found fairly problematic, suggesting that Victoire Ingabire could be put back in prison if she didn't humble herself, which again is not necessarily the rhetoric that, perhaps shows a true change in tactic. On the other hand, we also saw the release of Diane and Adeline Rwigara after a year in prison. That release did coincide with, international pressure. So the actions of the Rwandan government do suggest that they are listening to some of the critiques that they're getting. The rhetoric, however, does contradict that. So maybe the answer to your question is I'm not totally sure.
I just want to give you a little bit of one of the more bizarre cases. This is the case of Boniface Twagirimana, who's the vice president of the FDU party, who was reported missing from a maximum security prison. And they announced that he had escaped from the prison just 5 days before being transferred there. This just doesn't make sense, that someone can escape from a maximum security prison, and also that he would escape from the prison just after being transferred there. There are other cases, as I mentioned earlier, people who have disappeared, people who have been assassinated. I think Kate has sort of indicated that whatever calculus the Rwandan government does use in these releases doesn't seem to reflect a change in position. It's almost as a magnanimous gesture of clemency or something, and an act that can be reversed on the whim of the president. That's not really a good basis to have a rule of law, especially when you're talking about the detention and arrest of people for long periods of time. It's a little bit more serious than that.
Want to add anything? Or? Looking for hands, otherwise I'm going to monopolize. I'll listen. All right, well, there's another sort of follow-up question on broader human rights conditions in Rwanda. As I mentioned up front, U.S. officials, when talking about concerns with regard to Rwanda's internal political conditions, have cited some of the human rights concerns raised today. They've also talked, and Kate, you alluded to this, actually both alluded to this as well, but they've talked about general democratic space and sort of democratic, the prospects for a future democratic transition of power, which could be one sign that Rwanda was opening up a little bit politically. So for example, then Assistant Secretary Yamamoto, who I mentioned testified last year, called on the government of Rwanda to consider, a future democratic transition. What kinds of legal changes or policy changes would be first and foremost required in your views for more open political competition to take place in some future date, separate from some of the things that you've addressed directly with prisoner issues?
Well, I'll start. I'm sure Kate will have some additional recommendations. I think if we can't change end the culture of impunity and the culture of fear, then all of the efforts to sort of rebuild civic space are doomed to fail, because people are basically understandably going to be scared to speak out and to question and to challenge government policies and decisions. That requires accountability and transparency. The need for an investigative mechanism into the murders that I mentioned is so important that it's hard to go beyond, not to have that reiterated, that this is what the United States needs to be asking about, this is what the international community needs to be asking about, this is what the AU needs to be asking about. Investigations. There are just too many people who have died and who have been killed under mysterious circumstances, and then the disappearances. I mentioned the penal code and the restrictions on freedom of expression, which are unique because of Rwanda's history of genocide, but which are also in need of reform and more precision because they're being subject to abuse now. I think the other thing I would mention, which we haven't really touched upon here, is the restrictions in terms of registration for civil society organizations. And this is something that sounds very mundane and innocuous, but if you can't operate your NGO because you can't get your license, or you can't provide enough financial data about your operations, or list all of your funders, you can't operate, and so you're silenced. It doesn't sound very dangerous, but in fact it is incredibly destructive to civil society NGOs. So there are some very big blocks that the Rwandan government should be encouraged to address in terms of reform, and they're ones that need to be echoed here in Washington. One of the things that people talk about and the Rwandan government officials talk about is their affirmative action on female representation in government, which is, I think, if not the leading, maybe the second most diverse. And then, of course, we've talked about the economic recovery of Rwanda. All of those are legitimate things, no question about that, but it's only half of the story. And if we don't talk about the other half of the story, then the other half of the story continues in this silence where terrible things happen.
Just mention to start with respect to the large percentage of female parliamentarians, that I was actually chatting earlier today with a Rwandan colleague, and I made the point that Rwanda does have this terrific large percentage of female parliamentarians, and my colleague sort of made the point that maybe that doesn't matter much if those people weren't properly elected. That it's hard to say you have strong female representation if those women weren't elected in free and fair elections. To get back to your original question, from a legal standpoint, we would often talk about two different kinds of human rights violations. You have de jure violations, which are violations that are actually codified into domestic law, and you also have de facto violations, which are violations that occur in spite of the protections that domestic law provides. I think in Rwanda, we see both. As Adate mentioned, there are concerns with the associations and civil society laws and cutting down on that space and how difficult it might be for organizations to register. I also think that Rwanda's freedom of expression laws, while very understandably coming from a particular historical context, do kind of cross the line into cutting down on freedom of expression in a way that is impermissible under international law. But the larger point that I want to make here is actually Rwandan law does have some very good protections against many of the abuses that we do see. So for example, as I mentioned, torture is unfortunately fairly widespread in Rwanda. It's also illegal under Rwandan law, and Rwanda has recently signed up to the Convention Against Torture, kind of, I think it's the optional protocol, but there are plenty of structures in place that should ensure that torture doesn't happen in Rwanda, and to the extent that it does, the perpetrators are held to account. And that's simply not the case. So I think in addition to the question of like what are the legal changes that Rwanda needs to make, there's perhaps a question that we should get to before that, which is how do we get the Rwandan government to comply with the protections that are already codified into its law? Because a law is really only as good as adherence to it.
I want to thank the panelists. I wanted to give Veronica the chance to make any concluding remarks, if you had any, or no, not for now. All right. Well, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the audience, and please join me in extending a warm round of applause.